So I called it Revisiting the Strategic Plan. On the one hand, clearly you've done an enormous amount of work in this plan. There's a lot of pride in this plan. It's a good plan. I don't mean to say that you need to go back and start over again. That's certainly not the point here. But the kinds of conversations you've already started to have this morning about what are some of the, within that context of this plan, what are some of the directions we should focus on? Or what does that mean concretely in terms of specific activities? Those are the kinds of things I want us to be talking about today, so that we can come out today, or at least this will lead to another meeting in which you can start to say, wow, we've got so many long things on our long list. How do we focus our time and our attention, particularly when we're still in the middle of a crisis that requires a lot of day-to-day responsiveness? So one of the pre-readings that I sent out was a chapter in a book by Holden Thorpe and Buck Goldstein called Strategy is Critical and Very Difficult, which I thought was helpful. Obviously, we already heard from Professor Tower. He's a professor of strategy and one of the co-chairs, so he can say much more than I can about this. But I thought it was helpful to talk about some of the unique challenges in setting strategy at a higher education institution. So they say in business, strategy is driven by the changing needs of customers, competitive threats and new technology. The fear of lost market share and diminished profits forces companies to make hard choices and adopt a clear strategic direction. You could argue that these things are true in a slightly different way in higher education as well, whether it is enrollment declines or new ways of supporting students. But then they say in higher education, though, endowment, loyal alumni, government funding, and politics, by that I think they mostly mean internal politics, provide a cushion against market forces, delaying the need for a clear strategic direction or encouraging a copycat strategy that's not sustainable. They've got examples of strategic directions that are thwarted again and again by different groups on campus. So they argue strategy is about being different and about making hard choices. But a university community, which is typically governed by consensus, resists direction from the top and has great difficulty choosing among competing priorities that create winners and losers. I think that's what I take to be part of what Dave Damari was saying in his comment in the chat, which is we have to make these difficult choices, even though politically that's very difficult. And I know, having reviewed hundreds of university strategic plans, they often push those hard decisions outside the purview of that plan. At least they don't highlight them. I'm working with one university now who is looking at doing program prioritization, but they want to prioritize in line with their strategy. But their strategy said, we want to be an AAU research university, and we want to be much more representative of the population in our state. And they're finding it's very difficult to reconcile those two things. Both are incredibly expensive and require different kinds of investments, and they haven't made those trade-offs yet in that strategic plan. So we did a study on strategic planning and found a series of cognitive barriers to strategic thinking. I won't go through all of them, but a couple are particularly relevant for today. In each case, there is a psychological phenomenon. One of my colleagues is a PhD cognitive psychologist who worked on this, that simply makes it difficult for us as human beings to think about the future in certain ways. So whether that is over-relying on the present, basically saying that the future will look a lot like the past. That's obviously less of a risk today, given what we've been through in the last couple of months. Or the desire for innovation without thinking through what its real impact is going to be, what we call the buzzword blind spot. I want to focus today on the what we call the stay the course syndrome, which is adhering to a plan even in the face of its untenability. And then I'll talk later about the data delusion. That is, what happens if you're too focused on a narrowly defined set of measures. So the stay the course syndrome, so the two of the technical psychological terms are, first, the sunk cost fallacy, which is that, well, because we've been investing in this program, this activity, this unit, this person for so long, we should continue to invest in them. We know that that is a fallacy. We might continue to waste money on some of these activities, but politically it's very difficult, even cognitively very difficult to say, we're going to take that loss and invest that money somewhere else. The other aspect is what's called the availability cascade. That is, the more you hear people talking about something, the more it tends to feel real. So again, talking about a program that's been around forever, people talk about it all the time, makes it very difficult to imagine what would the world be like without that program or that activity or that office. And so it becomes harder to convince people that you could be successful, maybe even more successful without that. So a couple of the tools that we developed to help people build that future strategy. Of course, you're not building a new strategy now, but we're going to be reassessing it a little bit. We did a lot of work in scenario planning over the past 2 years. So again, before COVID, it was hard to think about radically different futures. And so we helped create a number of different universities of the future that were helpful exercises in getting people out of the day-to-day, the incremental, the focus on if we just had a little bit more resources, if we just made our class next year, to, wow, what would it look like if things were radically different? Also, reverse engineering. So how do we work backwards from a goal? So this institution I mentioned before, they want to be an AAU university, so an elite research university. When I look at their numbers now, I say, wow, you've got at least a 10 or a 15-year trajectory if you are totally focused on that, but you have other aspects that you want to do as well. They hadn't thought through, we'd have to hire 100 new faculty members who were all world-class researchers. We have to build them laboratories. We'd have to give them large startup packages. They hadn't quite thought through that. For you, it might be about the what would it take to be a real leader in online education or adult-focused education. There might be a significant investments that have to be made there. And then what we're going to talk about today is assumptions evaluation. Every plan is built on certain assumptions about how the world works, how we think the world is going to look. And now that the world has changed, it's important to go back and reassess some of those assumptions. So one of the ways we framed it in our research was going through as you're building a plan, or now once the plan is built, and asking questions about what we called here establishing assumptions tripwires. That is, this plan assumes that we will be able to recruit through our normal channels. It assumes that we'll be able to bring students back to campus and have all of our normal student activities and student athletics. Once that's changed, then now our assumptions about how many students will come to campus or how we need to recruit them have to change dramatically. And you've been adjusting to that week by week over the past couple of months, but thinking about what does that look like this term and next term, and what might that look like next year? The tripwires are where you become very explicit about, we think that this plan is appropriate as long as we can continue to grow enrollment. But if we fall below, say, a certain number of applications, or if our yield decreases a certain amount, that might be a sign that we are not on track to hit those targets. And I rarely see institutions operationalize their plan in this way. But we'll talk a bit about, for your plan, what are some of the things that you would need to do to, say, hit that goal for your capital campaign? What are the leading indicators and maybe the lagging indicators of progress towards that plan? There's also a factor that comes up here about rewarding those folks who come back and question some of those assumptions. There's a tendency among human beings, and certainly in universities, to say, well, you know, I'm personally skeptical we'll hit that goal, but everyone else seems comfortable with it, or I don't want to be the one to look like the naysayer. You need to create a comfortable space, and hopefully we can do that today, where among this group you can say, hey, I think that's a great goal to have, but I just don't see how we're going to do that. Or I don't think we could do that unless we were able to do A, B, and C to get there. Those are the kinds of conversations that I'm sure happened in the building of your plan. They need to be revisited to some extent now as those assumptions might have to shift. So we built a longer workshop. We're going to do a small part of that, which is a strategic plan revision workshop. We're not going to go rewrite your strategic plan. I know so much work went into that, and it's a very strong plan. But we're going to do essentially that first part, which is strategic assumptions updating. So we're going to look at your plan, and I'm going to ask you to think about what are some of the assumptions that were behind this plan. They don't need to be, you don't need to have been in the room to know what was actually in the minds of the people who wrote those words, although many of you were in those rooms. But rather, looking at the plan now, what assumptions are implicit in those goals, and which of those assumptions have to be altered now that we are living in a different world. So that's what we're going to move on to in a second. Let me give you a couple quick examples here. You might have a goal around growing or diversifying enrollments. These are a little bit generic because you need sustainable revenue. Under COVID, you might say, well, now we've got to really develop a diversity of market responsive programs. That is, we had already talked about program innovation, but we might need even more innovation now as we might see the job market fragmenting. We might see certain industries growing and shrinking that are different from what was happening before COVID. If I talk about the third one, engaging and serving local communities, we want to be supporting regional economic development. Well, now it might be important to really build more tightly those connections between K-12 and higher ed. or as we were just hearing before at the Kendall School, thinking about how we engage with local employers in new kinds of ways. We might have thought about, hey, we're going to build an internship where students would go out and work at those companies. That's not possible right now. So how do we find other ways to engage them? Expanding alumni engagement, we might think now, well, certainly we still want that philanthropic support, but our alumni might be struggling now. They might be looking at changing careers. How can we support them in those career changes, both as alumni, but also as potential students for us? So that gives you at least some high-level sense of what those might look like. So on this slide, I've summarized at a high level your strategic plan overview. I pulled this directly from the brochure that you've got. Obviously, there are more details under each one of these. My assumption is you're all pretty familiar with this already, and we started there, but I wanted to have it up in front of us.